I want to say to my babies that your mama loves you so much. I just feel in my heart that you're okay. We will do anything we will to help you to get them home. Please bring them home.
A composite picture of the suspect is already up in storefront windows.
Did you believe her?
Yeah. Everybody believed her.
I did.
Well,
My body got
something wasn't right from the beginning.
I did not have anything to do with the abduction of my children.
Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. Today, we're diving deep into a case you very likely already heard of, the Susan Smith case. A mother, 2 young boys, a bold kidnapping, and tearless pleas for help broadcast across the nation. But as the days passed, the pieces were not fitting together. What was happening behind the scenes while the world was searching? What wild backstory and tangled motives set this tragedy in motion? And what have the past 30 years made impossible to ignore? Hold on tight while we unravel this case and the beyond cold-hearted woman behind it, from A to Z. Let's go. On October 25, 1994, Susan Smith stood in front of cameras pleading for the safe return of her 2 young sons.
I can't express how much they are wanted back home, how much we love them, we miss them.
Next to her, David Smith, the boys' father, remained supportive. He looked shaken, but composed.
I would like to take the time to plead to the American public that you please do not give up on these 2 little boys in the search for their return safe home to us. That you continue to look for this car, these 2, our children, and for the suspect himself, that you continue to keep your eyes open, and anything that you see that might would help to please call and let it be known. We ask that you continue to pray for me and my wife and for our family, but most of all that you continue to pray the American public, continue to pray for Michael and Alex, that they are returned home safely to their mother and father and the family members who love them so much, that you pray most of all for them, and that they are being taken care of, and that they are safe, and that they will return home safely.
Susan told police she had been stopped at a red light at an intersection in Union, South Carolina, when a black man with a gun forced his way into her red Mazda. She claimed the man ordered her to drive for some time before making her stop on a rural road. Then, she said, he forced her out of the vehicle and drove off, taking her 2 sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, still strapped in their car seats with him.
I was stopped at a red light, and just out of nowhere, this black guy came up and just opened the door and jumped in the car. And he had a gun, and he had it pointed in my side and told me to drive. And so I did. And when I tried to ask him why he was doing this or whatever, he just told me to shut up or he'd kill me. So I just kept driving. My babies were in the back seat and they were crying. And I tried to tell him everything was gonna be okay. He told me to get out. And I said, well, can I get my children? And he said, no. He said, I don't have time for that. And they were just crying. And
panicked and disoriented, Susan ran toward a nearby home, frantically pounding on the door for help. A resident answered and quickly called 911.
Yeah, there's a lady that come up to our door, and some guy jumped into a red light with her car with her 2 kids in it, and he took off, and she got out of the car here at our house.
And he's got the kids?
Yes, ma'am, in her car. And she's real hysterical, and I just decided I need to call the law and get them down here.
Get them going, Pam. They got 2 kids.
Police arrived within minutes and immediately launched a search. For the next 9 days, the entire nation was gripped by the heartbreaking ordeal of a young mother pleading for her children's safe return. 2 young children being abducted by a stranger had people on high alert. Roadblocks were set up and Amber Alerts were issued, while flyers with Michael and Alex's faces were posted in stores and gas stations. Investigators reviewed security footage, checked traffic cameras, and questioned witnesses. But no one had seen any carjacking that night. Authorities expanded their search across Union County and beyond. Countless officers, volunteers, and search dogs combed through rural roads and wooded areas. Lakes and rivers were checked, but nothing turned up. Helicopters scoured highways for any trace of the Mazda protege. Investigators also searched crime reports of similar incidents, but no cases matched Susan's story. The case quickly gained national attention. News networks broadcast Susan's pleas, and families across the country followed every update. If you had a TV on during that time, it was nearly impossible to avoid the coverage. Susan's face became a national image of a grieving mother, appearing on every major news station. News crews flooded Union, capturing every development. Local residents helped organize community searches, and businesses donated food and supplies for search crews. Residents even left their porch lights on in solidarity, hoping the boys would be brought home safely. The FBI joined the investigation, and tips poured in as Susan's public pleas continued. But behind the scenes, investigators were starting to have doubts. Over the next few days, they kept pushing her, digging deeper with every conversation. They noticed that Susan's demeanor fluctuated. At press conferences, she appeared distraught and emotional. But other times, she seemed calm and detached, especially in private conversations with officers. One detective noted how Susan seemed almost giddy about one of her sit-down television interviews. Before it began, she turned to David, wide-eyed and incredulous, as if excited about being on TV. Then, as soon as the cameras started rolling, she shifted into her grieving mother persona. She was reveling in the spotlight. Meanwhile, 24-year-old David sat beside her, shell-shocked, his expression never changing. Officers also noted that Susan wasn't asking any questions about the search for her sons. Parents of missing children usually wanted constant updates. What was being done? Had police checked new areas? Did they have any leads? But Susan was uncharacteristically passive, waiting for detectives to approach her rather than demanding answers. And when she was alone, her behavior was even stranger. She was seen laughing and chatting casually when she thought no one was watching. Investigators noted her mood shifts, how she could go from sobbing in front of cameras to being composed in private. And speaking of sobbing, that term is being generous, because officers weren't the only ones who noticed that her tearful pleas never seemed to produce any actual tears. And then there were the details of her story that didn't quite add up. She claimed the carjacker forced her to drive around for nearly an hour before making her pull over. But when police retraced her route, they found no witnesses, no security footage, and no evidence to support her timeline. And then there was the red light. Susan initially told police she had been stopped at a red light on Monarch Mills Road when the man approached her car. But late at night, the traffic lights were timed, so a red light would only be triggered by cross traffic and would not stay red for as long as she reported. And no one reported seeing a stranded woman or a struggle at the intersection. There was also a lack of physical evidence. There were no tire marks where Susan claimed she had been forced out of the vehicle and the assailant sped off. No one had seen Susan's Mazda. No sightings, nothing. By the third day of searching, investigators stopped focusing on finding the carjacker and started focusing on Susan. At first, investigators kept their suspicions quiet, still treating the case publicly as an active search. But behind the scenes, they were now gathering evidence against Susan. They started by re-interviewing her, asking her to go over her story again, slowly and in detail. Each time she retold it, the timeline shifted slightly. She could not remember exactly how long the carjacker had forced her to drive. She wasn't sure which direction she had been facing at the red light. She said she struggled when the man pushed her out of the car, yet there were no injuries or signs of a struggle on her or at the scene where she claimed the incident occurred. The more she talked, the more her story unraveled. So they had her undergo a polygraph test, 2 of them. She failed both of them. And while not admissible in court, they revealed to police that Susan had something to hide. As the days passed, those polygraph failures, along with the inconsistencies in her statements, would get leaked to the public.
It's got me all puzzled now, because she failed it 2 times, and there's something wrong somewhere or another.
Fully convinced that Susan was being truthful about the encounter, David tried his best to appease her. telling her she was just failing the polygraphs because she was distraught from all that she had been through. He coached her on how to relax during the tests, but he also noticed how she was more worried about whether people thought she was lying than she was about their boys. But law enforcement saw things differently. With each passing day, detectives grew even more certain that Susan was lying. So they called her in for another interrogation. It had been 9 days since their boys had gone missing. And before her interview with police, she and David sat down that morning for what would end up being their final TV interview.
I think it takes a very sick and emotionally unstable person to be able to take two beautiful children like that, to be able to keep them from their parents.
Then it was time for her police interview. Sheriff Howard Wells, who also happened to be Susan's godfather, directly confronted Susan about her story, telling her that he knew she was lying about the carjacking. He pointed out that she could not have been stopped at the red light on Monarch Mills Road if there were no other cars around. He reminded her that she had already revised her statement to account for that inconsistency, but even her backup story didn't hold up. Then Wells revealed something Susan had not expected. He told her that undercover officers had been stationed at that intersection that night for a drug investigation, and that they did not see any carjacker. Her back was against the wall. Wells told Susan that he would have to go public with the truth. Her false accusation had caused tension within Union's black community, and he couldn't allow the lie to stand. At that moment, Susan asked him to pray with her. As their prayer ended, Wells looked at her and said, "Susan, it is time." She dropped her head and began to sob, repeating how ashamed she was. Then, in a moment of desperation, she asked Sheriff Wells for his gun to use on herself. When he asked why, she said, "You don't understand. My children are not all right." She then described the crushing isolation that she had felt driving along Highway 49 that night. She had planned to take her sons to her mother's house, but her emotional state was so overwhelming that she believed not even her mother could help her. She spoke about her lifelong feelings of loneliness, failure, and despair, and about her abortion and her troubled marriage to David. Susan agreed to give a written confession. She began carefully filling 2 pages. She wrote in rounded script, drawing little hearts when she wrote the word heart. In her confession, she explained that she had originally planned to drive into the lake alone. But then she said she believed her children would be better off with God than they would be left behind without a mother. She wrote, "I had no hope. I couldn't be a good mom anymore, but I didn't want them to grow up without a mom." She said she was ready to go down that ramp into the water, and I did go part way. But I stopped. I went again, and stopped. She said she tried 3 times to let the car roll into the water, shifting it into neutral. But each time she pulled the parking brake before it could move forward. Then, standing outside the car and overcome with grief and desperation, she reached in one last time and let go. She wrote, "I was an absolute mental case. I couldn't believe what I had done. I never meant to hurt them. My children, Michael and Alex, are with our Heavenly Father now, and I know that they will never be hurt again. As a mom, that means more than words could ever say." The car, with Michael and Alex strapped inside, rolled forward, disappearing into the dark waters of the lake. And Susan walked away. The truth about her son's disappearance was no longer a mystery, but the darker truth behind what led to it all was yet to unfold. The uncomfortable details began spilling out when detectives asked Susan why she did it. She admitted that it revolved around the contents of a letter. But to understand the letter and why it mattered so much, we first have to look back at the slow-motion disaster that had been Susan Smith's life up until that point. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971 in Union, South Carolina. When she was 6 years old, her father, Harry Vaughn, died by suicide. Her mother, Linda Vaughn, later married Beverly Russell, a local businessman and active member of the Christian Coalition. As a teenager, Susan reported that Beverly had sexually abused her, which he later admitted to. After high school, Susan took a job at Conso Products, a textile company in Union. It was there that she met David Smith and the two began dating. Their relationship moved quickly, and in March 1991, when Susan was 19 years old, they got married. The marriage was unstable from the beginning. Both Susan and David were involved in extramarital affairs, and their relationship was marked by frequent arguments and separations. Despite the turmoil, they had 2 children together. Michael in 1991, and Alex in 1993. Financial struggles added to the couple's marital problems. They lived in a modest home in Union, and while both worked, money was tight. Susan had expensive tastes and reportedly resented their financial situation. Susan and David separated multiple times, and in May 1994, they officially divorced. So despite appearing as a couple in front of the cameras, David and Susan had actually been legally divorced for months. And while they remained connected through their sons, Susan had started moving on with her personal life. Not long after the divorce, she became involved with someone new. This new relationship quickly became the center of Susan's attention, and as she would reveal to investigators, a key part of what led to her boys being at the bottom of a lake. His name was Tom Findley. He was the son of her boss, Akonso. By all accounts, he was nothing like David. He came from a well-known local family and had the kind of wealth and status that Susan had always seemed to crave. But, by her own admission, Susan was also sleeping with her boss, Tom's father. Which brings us back to her confession, and that letter. Tom was justifiably not pleased that Susan was sleeping with his father. That admission, which Susan later recanted, was just one of several reasons he decided to end things with her. He outlined them all in a letter to her, stating in part, "You will without a doubt make some lucky man a great wife, but unfortunately, it won't be me. We come from two different backgrounds." He encouraged Susan to avoid getting involved with married men. He also said, "Susan, I could really fall for you, but like I told you, some things are not suited for me. And yes, I am talking about the children. I do not want children, and I don't want the responsibility of your children either. I am sure that your kids are good kids, but it really wouldn't matter how good they may be. The fact is, I just don't want children. These feelings may change one day, but I doubt it." His final statement to her was, "You have to make your own decisions in life, but remember, you have to live with the consequences of those decisions." In her confession letter, Susan openly admitted that Tom's rejection was at the heart of her despair and her deadly decision. She wrote, "I was in love with someone very much, but he didn't love me and never would." With her confession now on record, investigators formally placed Susan under arrest for 2 counts of murder. Before making any announcements or notifying family, authorities worked to confirm Susan's statements. They sent in divers to locate the submerged vehicle and the boys' bodies in John D. Long Lake. Using sonar equipment, they located a vehicle submerged about 122 feet from the shore, resting in 18 feet of water. As the car was pulled out, it became immediately clear that the 2 boys were still inside, strapped into their car seats just as Susan had described. Authorities at the scene visibly reacted, some turning away, others appearing emotional as the reality set in. Emergency personnel confirmed the deaths of Michael and Alex Smith. Once the vehicle was fully removed, forensic teams began their examination. The car doors were locked, reinforcing Susan's admission that she had intentionally left her sons trapped inside as the car sank. With the vehicle and bodies recovered, the case against Susan Smith was now fully confirmed with physical evidence. The sheriff announced Susan's arrest, but by then her confession had already been leaked to the media. So, David and Susan's family found out that Susan had killed her own sons the way the rest of the world did, on television.
Susan Smith has been arrested and will be charged with 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of her children, Michael 3 and Alexander 14 months.
Overnight, Susan Smith became the most reviled woman in the country.
Susan Smith is being arraigned in Union, South Carolina this morning
and confessed to killing her 2 young sons.
The crime horrified the nation.
And I would like to wear this white rose this morning for those 2 sweet children.
People who had prayed for Michael and Alex's safe return were now horrified. The town of Union, which had rallied behind her, felt betrayed. People who had supported her during the search turned against her. Some of her own family members even distanced themselves from her.
And I just couldn't believe that somebody could do that to their children.
There's no reason on this earth for a mother to do that to her children.
Did you believe her?
Yeah. Everybody believed her.
I did.
Well,
My body got
something wasn't right from the beginning.
The media frenzy exploded with headlines calling her a monster and the most hated mother in America. When Susan was taken into custody, An angry crowd was there to greet her. But the outrage wasn't just about what she had done. It was also about who she had blamed. For 9 days, Susan had let the country believe that a black man had kidnapped her children at gunpoint, stoking racial fears and leading to unwarranted suspicion cast on innocent people. Her lie hit especially hard in Union, a town with a long and complicated history of racial tension and division. But Susan's mother, Linda Russell, felt differently. She was furious at how the media portrayed her daughter, stating, "We wanted Susan tried in a court of law, not in the press. They have brutalized her. I think you all ought to be ashamed of yourselves." With Susan's statements on record and the physical evidence recovered, the full picture of her cold and calculated actions became clear. In the days leading up to the tragic night, people around 22-year-old Susan noticed something was off. Friends said she seemed troubled but never explained why. Coworkers said she spoke constantly about Tom Findlay. On the afternoon of October 25th, after arguing with Tom and realizing their relationship was over, Susan left work early. Instead of heading home, she picked her boys up from daycare, spent the next several hours driving aimlessly around Union. By 9 p.m., she arrived at the quiet, rural lake outside of town. A passing driver later reported seeing Susan alone in the front of her car, which directly contradicted being forced to drive around with her carjacker. Susan sat with her sons for several minutes. Sensing something unusual, Michael asked, "Mommy, where are we going?" Susan did not answer. Susan released her car into the lake where it drifted away before sinking. Once she sent her sons to their deaths, Susan did not call for help. She did not run into the water. She simply turned and walked away. She climbed the boat ramp, made her way over to Highway 49, then ran about 100 yards to the nearest home with its porch lights on. She banged on the door and told the homeowners her fabricated story. In a quiet moment during her final interrogation, an agent asked Susan, "If you had one wish, what would it be?" She replied, she wished that she had never told Tom Findlay about her affair with his father. Susan Smith's trial began on July 10, 1995, while the O.J. Simpson trial was still dominating national headlines. With the public already captivated by that high-profile case, Susan's trial became another media spectacle. News outlets rented out dozens of storefronts for the length of the trial. Scaffolding was built to support camera crews, and the entire street leading up to the courthouse was lined with media trucks. A local skating rink was turned into a temporary hotel for reporters. Journalists even hid in trees and behind bushes, trying to capture any glimpse of those involved. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that Susan's actions were premeditated. Their case focused on Susan's obsession with Tom Findlay and her desire to remove her children to win him back. Forensic experts testified that the boys were alive when the car entered the water. Tests were conducted to determine how long it would take for the car to float and then sink, to show the jury the experience from the boys' perspective. As the prosecution played the video of the car sinking reenactment, attempting to get it admitted into evidence, Susan and a paralegal were observed giggling and playing. The video was successfully admitted, and when it was later played for the jury, Susan, still sitting in the same position in the courtroom, was instead crying. The obvious difference between her private reaction and her public performance reinforced what law enforcement already suspected, that Susan's displays of emotions both before and after the crime were an act. The defense did not deny that Susan killed her children. Instead, they argued that she was mentally unstable. A psychiatrist testified that Susan suffered from chronic depression and adjustment disorders. He stated that to satisfy a need to feel wanted, that Susan was, at the time, having sexual relationships with her boss at Conso, his son Tom Findlay, her stepfather Beverly Russell, and her ex-husband David Smith. Beverly Russell took the stand and admitted his abuse of Susan growing up and well beyond. After her arrest, he wrote her a letter expressing his guilt and suggesting that his actions contributed to what happened. He wrote, "I want to tell you how sorry I am for letting you down as a father. Many believe my failure didn't have anything to do with October 25th, but I believe it did. I want you to know that you can't take the blame for this whole tragedy." The prosecution argued that Beverly Russell's testimony was an attempt to shift some of the blame away from Susan. Another detail entered into evidence was that Susan had placed her wedding dress and wedding album in the trunk of the car before it sank, possibly a symbolic act of burying her past along with her sons, but also a potential indication of her premeditation. The defense asked the jury to consider life in prison instead of the death penalty, claiming that Susan acted out of desperation, not cruelty. On July 22, 1995, after just 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Susan guilty on both counts of murder. But instead of sentencing her to death, the jury recommended life in prison. This decision was largely influenced by testimony about Susan's mental health struggles and childhood trauma. However, at the time of her sentencing, a life sentence did not necessarily mean life behind bars. Under the law at the time, a life sentence meant that the defendant would be eligible for parole after 30 years. But jurors were not allowed to be informed of this fact. In fact, when the jury asked whether Susan would be eligible for parole, the judge instructed them to take a life sentence at its plain and usual meaning. The following year, laws changed to allow jurors to be informed about a defendant's parole eligibility. In the years following the loss of his sons, David Smith struggled to rebuild his life. He wrote a book sharing his story and pain called Beyond All Reason: My Life with Susan Smith. Some people saw the book as a way for him to process his grief. Others questioned his decision to profit from the tragedy. David remarried and divorced twice before marrying his current wife, Tiffany Smith. They have built a new life together, mostly staying out of the public eye. Susan's pattern of using people and relationships to get what she wanted continued once she was behind bars involving both prison staff and fellow inmates. In 2000, it was discovered that she had sex with a prison guard, who later served 3 months in jail for the relationship. Not long after, Susan became involved with Captain Alfred Rowe Jr., the head of security at the prison. According to Rowe, Susan would flirt with him, chat regularly, and like other inmates, even expose herself by dropping her towel as she passed him after showering. She also ratted out other inmates to gain his trust and get closer to him. Eventually, Susan offered him oral sex, which he accepted. Afterward, Rowe realized that he had just broken the law and risked up to 10 years in prison. Soon after, rumors started circulating and Rowe suspected that Susan had turned him in. What he thought was a one-time, no-strings encounter became a full-blown scandal. Rowe was arrested, lost his job, and was sentenced to 5 years probation and 400 hours of community service. He was also added to the National Sex Offender Registry, where his name will remain for the rest of his life. His marriage survived, but he has been unable to find steady work since. He believes that Susan reported him to manufacture a scandal that would get her transferred to Leith Correctional Institution, a prison closer to her mother. In the end, Susan was indeed transferred, and Rowe lost everything. And Susan's relationships were not limited to staff. According to a former cellmate, Susan has also been in an ongoing romantic and sexual relationship with another female inmate who is black. An irony not lost on people familiar with Susan's original false claims about a black man carjacking her. When Susan was in an argument with one of her lovers, her cellmate overheard Susan tell the woman, "I killed my f***ing kids. Do you think I care about yours?" That former cellmate, named Christy, used to serve as Susan's guppy, acting as a lookout during Susan's sexual encounters, helping her obtain drugs and covering for her. At one point, Susan apologized to Christy for a close call that Christy had while covering for her. To reassure her, Susan promised to give her $300 the next day as a thank you, a huge amount to be exchanging behind bars, but a trivial amount for Susan. Which leads to Susan's financial situation. According to Christy, money talks, and Susan Smith had a lot of it. So combining her money with being a long-serving inmate, Susan has a lot of power behind bars. Christy commented that if she were released, Susan could live the rest of her life with the money she's got. As for where she got so much money, Susan has received a steady stream of financial support from people on the outside, including through sites like writeaprisoner.com, where she received so many messages and negative media attention that the site eventually removed her profile. But Susan still receives a seemingly endless flow of money, from strangers to men she met online, and even a documentary filmmaker who deposited money into her prison account in exchange for information, a violation that led to disciplinary action in 2024. At one point, a man who had fallen for Susan said he planned to give her over $200,000 upon her release. One former admirer corresponded with her for 18 months. He noted how she never asked him for anything directly, but happily accepted whatever he sent. He loved her, but after finding out she was communicating with other men, he determined she probably didn't love him. He ended their relationship and said he felt duped. After serving 30 years in prison, Susan became eligible for parole in November 2024. From prosecutors to David Smith to the correctional officer whose life she ruined to her fellow inmates, no one believed that she had been rehabilitated or deserved release. At her hearing, she cried and expressed remorse.
Ms. Smith,
yes, ma'am.
What would you like to tell us today?
First of all, I want to say how very sorry I am.
It's okay, Susan. Just talk with us.
I know that what I did was horrible. And I would give anything if I could go back and change it. And I love Michael and Alice with all my heart.
Influence of drugs or alcohol the night that you murdered your children?
No, ma'am, I was not.
Your attorney talked about working with mental health. Is that helpful to you?
Ma'am?
Mr. Thomas,
I hear you.
Mr. Thomas talked about the fact that you were working with mental health, and my question is that helpful to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that something that you would be willing to continue with on the outside if you were granted parole?
Yes, ma'am.
Susan's dramatic display of emotion does not at all match the straightforward, neutral line of questioning. Her exaggerated reaction just doesn't fit the moment.
Ms. Smith, your crime took a lot of resources from the law enforcement community. What, if anything, would you say to the folks who worked so hard to find your children if you had the opportunity to speak to them today?
That I'm sorry that I put them through that. I really, really am. I'm actually sorry to the drivers that I had to find them. I wish I could take that back. I really do. I didn't lie to get away with it. I really didn't. I was just scared. I didn't know how I could tell the people that loved them that they would never see them again. I didn't know how I could tell David he couldn't see his son again. And I'm sorry. I don't know. I know that's not enough. I know it's not, but I don't know. I know those just sound like words, but they come from my heart. They really do.
Many noticed that Susan's emotional display felt familiar. That despite the constant tissue dabbing and sniffles, it was nearly identical to the tearless pleas she had made to the nation 30 years earlier.
What do you think is the most important thing that you have learned while you have been incarcerated?
That people are important, that forgiveness and love, that family is important, and that decisions we make not just affect us, they affect the people that we love. And not to take things or people for granted.
All right, is there anything else that you would like to tell us today that wasn't in your packet or that has not already been said?
I would just like to say that I am a Christian and God is a big part of my life, and I know He has forgiven me, and it is by His grace and mercy and I have a lot of faith, and I live by that every day. And I just ask that you show that same kind of mercy as well. I guess, yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
David Smith attended the hearing and reminded the parole board that this was not a tragic accident, but a deliberate act. The parole board unanimously agreed. Susan's parole was denied, with her history of manipulative behavior and prison infractions weighing heavily in their decision. It was reported that Susan was devastated by the result. She remains incarcerated at Leith Correctional Institution. Her next parole hearing is scheduled for November 2026. Few believe that much will change by then. In the end, one thing has stayed the same. Susan Smith has always looked out for Susan Smith. From the lies she fed the public to her manipulation behind bars, every move she has made has been self-serving. But what do you think? Could there be a chance she has changed? Should parole ever be an option for someone who did what she did? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed how we covered this case, please help us by hitting like and subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss any of our videos. Thanks for watching.